Szanowni Państwo, ja się nazywam Bartłomiej Gajos, jestem historykiem pracującym w
My name is Bartłomiej Gajos. I work at the Polish-Russian Center.
Use such an adjective, I will speak English. Our last panel today is devoted to the revolution of 1917 and national and regional perspective. And we have three speakers. Our first speaker will be Professor Sarah Badcock from the University of Nottingham, and her research interests include history of Russia in late imperial and revolutionary periods, and she's the author of a book entitled Politics and the People in Revolutionary Russia and Provincial History.
Thank you. So, I'd like to speak to you today about provincial perspectives on 1917. And I'm going to ask first a key question, and my key question, which I hope is of interest to all of you, is, well, why do regional studies matter? And the story that I'm going to tell today about 1917 in the provinces is about the location of power. So where does power lie in 1917? And finally, the idea that I suppose I'm going to present today, my kind of key underpinning argument, if you like, is that I will argue that political elites in 1917, far from being the puppet masters of the revolution, were actually had their alternatives and options defined for them by the actions of ordinary people. And I think that exploration of regional power and regional perspectives helps us see that particular perspective. So when I started my studies on the 1917 revolution in the provinces, I was told by a very eminent scholar in the field, "My dear, don't bother with the provinces." He said, "When the bell tolls in Moscow, the bell tolls all over Russia." And this idea that the center defines what goes on across this massive, diverse Russian empire was an enduring one in the historiography. But it's one that regional perspectives have increasingly challenged. And I'm going to explore this question about regional perspectives through three key areas today. I'm going to start by talking about structures of power in the provinces, and also structures of powerlessness, I would argue. And then I'm going to go on to speak about people on the margins of power. And then finally, I'm going to illustrate those questions about power and marginalisation through a discussion of the food crisis in 1917. So those are the three key areas that I will cover. So first, thinking about structures of power and powerlessness in 1917. So I'm sure you're familiar with the question, the notion of dual power. And the idea of dual power is that, that there was a bifurcation of political power which emanated in Petrograd, and this bifurcation was split between the Petrograd Soviet on the one hand and the provisional government on the other, and that the Petrograd Soviet represented so-called democratic power or lower class power, and that the provisional government came to be associated with more bourgeois power. And so this model of dual power is one that's been bandied around over the years and which has been challenged and questioned. When we look at the provinces, however, what we see is that this model of dual power is not very helpful, because actually what happens within a specific regional space is very much dependent upon local actors and local contextual questions. So the two provinces in 1917 that I know the much about, which are Nizhny Novgorod and Kazan. In Nizhny Novgorod and Kazan, if we look at the structures of power that developed there, there is no question of dual power. That the town Duma played a part in local government, that provisional government-sponsored bodies played a part in local government, that Soviet-sponsored bodies played a part in local government, but that these different bodies and organisations worked together in different ways, but in actually often very harmonious ways in 1917, because they tended to share some key basic aims and goals. And I would say actually that in Petrograd in 1917 also, that the Provisional Government and the Petrograd Soviet shared a couple of key basic goals, and that was to avert anarchy, that is to maintain a rule of law, and to convene the Constituent Assembly, and to continue Russia's participation in the war. And these three basic goals of both provisional government and Soviet bodies are reflected in the ways in which they work collaboratively and together. But that when we go to provincial perspectives, we see that there are extremely diverse and varied structures of power, because we need to look to the locale to see the ways in which power operates. Well, that's political power. That's relatively straightforward to track, isn't it? But when we talk about political power as if it means something, political power, if it is to be enacted, needs to have something behind it. What I would argue when we look at the provinces in 1917 is that it exposes to us the degree of powerlessness that was invested in central power organisations and indeed regional power organisations. What I mean is that regional and national authority lacked any kind of enforcing measures. They were unable to implement policies that they made. And I can explain this in a couple of different ways. First, that the provisional government emphasised democratisation, and as indeed did the Soviet, the notion that in order to govern Russia effectively in these times of challenge, that the answer to the challenges of governing Russia were to be found in enabling ordinary people's participation in political process. So democratisation, that is the election of committees who would then enable local government, was very, very widespread in 1917. Now this democratisation process, the election of committees, and that would be food committees, land committees, committees for local government, this democratisation process did not entail an empowering of regional and national government, because as one elector in one particular region very eloquently stated, we elected you, you must listen to us. So the democratisation process in 1917 in the regions actually broke, to some extent, the links between the centre and the region and the districts, because local communities elected representatives who they demanded speak for their needs. I will give you an illustration of this problem. An illustration of this problem can be found if we look at the land committees. So the land committees, there was a central land committee, regional land committees, and sub-regional land committees. And these land committees were to be elected, and they were intended to support the provisional government's key objective on land relations, and that was to postpone any final decision on the land question until the convocation of the Constituent Assembly. So the policy which came from the centre was to hold. Please, they ask. They have to ask, because they do not have any compulsion mechanism. They say, please do not seize private landowners' estates. Please await the decision of the Constituent Assembly. In the meantime, we must continue with existing land regimes until there is a change. But the local land committees do not respond to this national demand. The local land committees respond to their local constituents. So the local land committees seize land. They do it often using pseudo-legal measures. This is not an explosion of violence that we see in rural space. It is actually a measured, a defined, a careful and determined attempt to reuse land, to control land resources in the regions. But it might be controlled, it might be managed, it might be careful, but it is nothing to do with central government policy. One of the best examples of this is in Kazan. In Kazan, the regional land committee, so that is the Gubernia land committee in Kazan, is exceptionally proactive. And in May 1917, it decrees that all privately held land is to be transferred to the use of the local communities. Just like that. So the provisional government snaps it back and says, you cannot transfer land into the hands of local communities. Privately held land is to be left in private hands until the convocation of the Constituent Assembly. What do you think the district and the sub-district land committees did? You think that they listened to the provisional government, or do you think that they responded to their local community? So what happens then is both an empowering of the local community through democratic process, but also a powerlessness, a breaking of the links between centre and periphery. So that's this question of power and powerlessness, which is my first little illustration. The second point I'd like to make is related to that, and that's about people on the margins of power. So I've described a process of democratisation, but that process was incomplete and imperfect. Just because there was a democratisation process did not mean that all people within communities had an equal say or an equal level of participation in those communities. In practice, the process of democratisation enables particular groups within communities. It enables the urban, it enables the ethnically Russian, it enables the men, and additionally, it enables actually armed men, soldiers. And these are the groups that are prioritised within the power structures that developed both nationally and regionally in 1917. So we can establish that. The reason, by the way, that one of the reasons that ethnically Russian men are privileged over non-ethnically Russian men is actually about the locations of power in urban spaces. So invariably, committees and local government mechanisms will be based within urban space, but these urban spaces are overwhelmingly ethnically Russian, even in areas where there are large non-ethnically Russian groups. And I'm thinking, for example, in a place like Kazan, where you have maybe 23% of the population are ethnically not Russian, but less than 0.1% of the Kazan urban space population is ethnically non-Russian. So most of the non-Russian peoples in Kazan lived in rural spaces, and because they lived in rural spaces, they are to some extent dislocated from this process of democratization. But while I'm emphasizing then that, that there were people who were left out, if you like, of this democratization process, I am not arguing that they are totally disempowered or that they become silent in 1917, because what we see actually in practice, in process, is that ordinary people, whether, and this is women, it's non-Russians, it's people without arms, are taking part in these revolutionary processes, and they're making their voices heard. And the illustration that I would use to explore that would be soldiers' wives. So for various reasons, which I'm not going to go into today, women tend to be marginalised in elected process in 1917. But just because they're marginalised in elected processes does not mean that they are marginalised in power structures always. So soldiers' wives never formed a national organisation or a national assembly, but they did form extremely powerful and meaningful local pressure groups across the empire in different ways and with different dynamic leaderships. And certainly in the three provinces I've looked at, in Kazan and Nizhny Novgorod and in Tambov, soldiers' wives were extremely active and extremely powerful. The ways in which they acted subverted the democratic processes that had developed in these regions. So, for example, in Kazan, where the soldiers' wives, just as they were actually right across the country, were protesting about a shortage of fuel, they were protesting about a shortage of labour, they demanded prisoners of war, and they demanded most of all an increase in their allowance, in the payment that they were given by the state. But they made these demands, they made them directly to the democratic local assemblies, and they did it forcefully. So although they weren't themselves elected onto these committees and were not therefore able to be involved in the democratic process from the inside, what they did was they organised to a mass petition. So it's a very old-fashioned way of participating in political process. But they also organised public demonstration. So the women of Kazan, and they did it in Tambov as well, they meet together in the center of town, quite large numbers of women with banners and placards, and then they make a noisy and disruptive march right through the center of the town, and they barrack the menfolk. They march to the Soviet, and then they stand outside the Soviet and shout until people came out. And the Soviet members, the deputies within the Soviet, are embarrassed. They are humiliated by these women who call on them repeatedly and who demand that their voices be heard. And so what actually happens in practice is, while the women are not let into the building, they are not kind of enabled into this democratic process, but their voices are heard, and the press, which reports this stuff extensively, the press reports that the Soviet meets their demands, that the Soviet enables an increase in their allowance, that the Soviet is doing its best to improve their fuel allowances, so that these marginalized groups also have a role to play in these processes of democratization, of power and powerlessness. So I think they're a good illustration of the ways in which power works in difficult and complex ways in 1917. So I'd like to go on finally to one more illustration, an example of how why locality matters in 1917. And I'd like to look at the food crisis. So the food crisis enables us, if we look at it from a local, I mean, the national perspective is well understood. There are a couple of extremely good works looking at what happens in 1917 with the food crisis, why it destabilizes the provisional government, why it was a problem for late imperial Russia too. But what we look at it, when we look at these food crises at regional perspective, what we see is the dominance of local narratives, so that local communities decide for themselves what their problem is, and that their direct action has an impact on those problems. That we see the utter powerlessness of central authority, and that we see as we go forward into Civil War period, that the state engages in extremely violent coercive measures in an attempt to respond to these crises of who controls food. And finally, we see the dynamism of local communities. So I'm conscious that I don't want to overrun my time, but what I would sort of point out is, if we look at Kazan and Nizhny Novgorod, two provinces sitting alongside one another, Kazan is traditionally a grain exporter. It produces more than it eats, so it is a big exporting province, whereas Nizhny Novgorod is traditionally an importing province. It eats more than it grows. So these two, we've got the deficit and the surplus province sitting alongside one another. Now the provisional government tries to control grain production and grain distribution by initiating a grain monopoly, where they say, okay, the state sets a fixed price on grain and the grain is bought by the state. But what actually happens is that local communities subvert, they refuse, they deny the central government directives, and they do it in a really direct way. They use their locally elected food committees to respond to their needs. So the locally elected food committees, if they are in a deficit province, they will demand very vociferously that they be provided with grain, and they send walkers across the boundaries into Kazan to buy grain for their community. So they transgress the requirements of national state. And if they are in a surplus province like Kazan, then they resist the demands of the state to sell at fixed price. This resistance is often particularly notable in non-Russian areas, in the Tatar villages, where there is sometimes quite a violent resistance to state intervention in grain. So what we see then is that the national body, the national authority, and its notional power, we talk about dual power as if it means anything, as if the provisional government and the Petrograd Soviet wanted anything different in relation to food supplies. They did not. They wanted the same thing, and they used the same tool, which was requests, appeals, declarations, proclamations. And what they found was that those appeals and proclamations fell on deaf ears. Because local communities, far from the perception that they were ignorant and dark, which was the ways in which they were represented through 1917, actually local communities were not at all ignorant, but they were dynamic and they responded to their local needs. So my conclusions then, I would like to reiterate then, I would regard regional studies as a way to enhance and sophisticate our understandings of political power and political participation. They do not take away the necessity of understanding central political power as well, but they rather enhance it. I think that they enable a more diverse understanding of the population and the ways in which populations respond to 1917. And then finally, just to reiterate that point I said I was going to make, I think that by looking at the peripheries and enabling us to get down into how ordinary people in various diverse ways respond to 1917, we see that political elites actually have their alternatives defined for them by the actions of ordinary people.
Thank you very much for your contribution. I think it's really interesting, those interdependencies between center and provinces, because if we change our perspective from Petrograd to, for example, Tambov, as you mentioned, we will tell a very different story of the Russian Revolution of 1917. And that's the first point I would like to make. And the second one is that you discussed the period which wasn't exactly discussed, hasn't been discussed so far. That's the period of provisional government right after the February Revolution. And we continue our provinces histories with Professor Liudmila Novikova, who is the Deputy Director of the International Center of History of the Second World War at the Higher School of Economics. And she's also the author of the book which was dedicated to the white movement in Russia's north. The floor is yours. Czy możemy poprosić o włączenie prezentacji? Okay, it works.
Спасибо. Я хочу произвести революцию на нашей конференции про революцию. Во-первых, я буду говорить по-русски, а во-вторых...
First and foremost, let me say that I'm going to speak in Russian, and my presentation in PowerPoint is also going to be in Russian.
Рассказать о революционном насилии в российской провинции, история и память, так называется моя презентация.
Now, I would like to talk about revolutionary violence in the provinces. And I will talk about three issues: violence in the provinces, different attitudes and different forms of revolutionary violence. Secondly, I would like to talk about how the memory of the revolution, its victims and the civil war was stored in the Soviet period, and also what's happening with these sites now. And this very much relates to what was said in the first panel, and one but last, because I am going to talk about memory in the context of the revolution and the civil war. Now, I'm looking at it from the regional context of the Archangel part of a province, which was a very large area, and this governorate reached from the Finnish border to the Urals along the Northern Ocean. So that particular governorate was very large, and it was a very important area of the Civil War. The white government, headed by Tchaikovsky, and then controlled by General Miller, that territory and that government fought until February 1920. A very important element of this part of the Civil War was the participation of the American, British, French and other militaries that participated in the war in that area. Now let me turn to violence in the revolution. Violence in the north of the country was used by all of the parties to the war. So the civilian authorities, the military authorities, and also those kind of grassroots spontaneous violence as well. Now, I would like to give you some comments on this, and then I'll carry on with the second part of the presentation. So, first of all, what provoked violence? It is widely held that the brutality and violence of the First World War was one of the reasons behind it, but this proposition may be questioned. In his work, Robert Garrett mentions that, on the one hand, not all of the participants in the First World War saw this surge in violence, and the reverse is also true. The countries that did see a lot of violence after the First World War, not all of them were active participants in the First World War. For example, 1% of the Finnish population was killed in 1 month, even though they didn't participate. In the Russian Civil War, violence was more prolonged, of course, and the symbol of the Civil War and of the White Terror were camps like this, Jokanga. These camps were already there in 17 and 18, and then they were moved to Murmansk. Now, the Jokanga camp is on an island on the Dvina River. The Red Army, the POVs, prisoners, and anybody who sympathized with the Bolsheviks were imprisoned in the camp. And this gives us a good idea of what White Terror was. This was a kind of a POV camp or a prison. It was not intended to kill the inmates, it was to hold them there until the end of the Civil War. 13 people who tried to organize rebellions or escapes were killed, plus several dozen died as a result of illness, hunger. Now, the caption is wrong here. This is not Jokanga, this is Ujuk. These were the barracks in the camp, and this is where the POVs were kept. So these were big barracks. Obviously, no single rooms were available, naturally. Lots of cases of typhoid, malnutrition, and other illnesses were amongst the main reasons for death. Now, this was Jokanga and Mudyuk again. And this is the Red Holmogorsky camp. Right after Holmogor was liberated by the Reds, it was converted into a concentration camp. You can see separate buildings at the entrance to the monastery that were used to house the POVs and prisoners. And this became a symbol of Red Terror, and that was like the original version before the gulags were established. And in this case, under the Reds, there were regular executions instigated by the commander of the camp, who would have people shot for any reason at all, and he organized public executions as well. Even the local party committee said that this should cease and that people cannot be executed just like that. And the scale of that was that then it took several weeks to get rid of the bodies. And a local Bolshevik wrote to Lenin about it. He said that the bestiality at Holmogorsky are outrageous. He said that 8,000 people were executed in that camp in 1920. The commander was then moved to another camp. They didn't want him to be a public person, but he continued his work at the camp he ended up in. In addition to the terror that was officially ordered, like in Holmogor, we can see that the attitudes of the Bolsheviks to very broad terror varied from one person to another. But there was also the other kind of terror, which was kind of grassroots, stemming from fighting for resources or interpersonal contacts, or basically trying to terrorize the enemy by making sure that they realize that if they lose, they will not just be imprisoned, but they will be killed. And the results were extremely drastic. People would be thrown into freezing water, or they'll be boiled. Now, this works if you need to terrorize people publicly by destroying the enemy. I was very moved when I first saw this photograph. This is a picture of the people they have just killed, and we can see one of the Red Army soldiers who's lying on the ground next to those bodies. These people no longer treated this as bestiality, they got used to it. So they actually wanted a commemorative photograph taken as a souvenir with the bodies of the people they killed before they were buried. One of the first monuments to the victims of the Civil War was erected in Murmansk. And the columns, there's a constructivist design, and it shows something like the captain's bridge on a ship. The representatives of different party committees would go up there, and down at the bottom, the working people, the workers and the peasants would pass during communist demonstrations. And there's an obelisk at the bottom, and says to the victims of the 1918-1920 intervention. This is a photograph from 1927. This was the 10th anniversary of the October Revolution. And people at the time remembered that the intervention forces went away in 1919, but the monument says 1920. So this seems a mistake. But why is this the case? Why did they write 1920 instead of 1919? On the one hand, this points to the three Entente interventions. This is the version of history created by the Stalinist historians and was made popular in the provinces. But as I worked in the archives at Archangel, I saw that many Bolsheviks would say there was no such a thing as the Civil War, that the north of Russia was occupied by the Entente, and that Bolsheviks were also sent to Africa to work as slaves. Now, I've never found any other mentions of that. I have not found any corroboration of these claims by the Bolsheviks. But in the first half of the 1920s, the Civil War was interpreted in the provinces as an occupation of Russia by foreigners. And that was very much supported, this reading, this interpretation was very much supported by the Bolshevik authorities, because that was a very good reason, or a very good way of explaining by the Bolsheviks why the North was given up so easily. It was never explained why or how Entente sea-born or sold was able to occupy these huge territories. That was omitted from this discourse. So instead of admitting to the shortages of food and not being able to control the country themselves, the Bolsheviks blamed it on the intervening Entente forces. It was basically much simpler to explain to your own people that the imperialists occupied our country. It was easier than to explain that many Russians voluntarily fought for the whites rather than against them, or became white partisans. So this version of history was there to integrate the people with the Soviet power. So we didn't have a division inside of the country, it was the foreigners who invaded us. As I worked in Murmansk, I discovered that there's, among the bodies buried under this monument, there's a railway employee who was not really a victim of the intervention or the war. He died of hunger. But the appalling economic situation in the country was explained by the Soviets by saying that it was all because of the foreign intervention. Now, it was not very clear to start with how to commemorate these events, and people had many different designs. These are some of the examples I found in archives. And then there were traditional monuments, and anywhere where the intervention took part, you can find these monuments. Most of the deceased were not people killed by the English or the French. They were mostly either killed by the White Army or they were local victims of the Civil War. And some more monuments built in the 20s and all the way until the 50s. They all look pretty much the same. An obelisk like this is very interesting. They were built to be very tall, so that the ships that were moored at Archangel Harbor could actually see the monuments to the victims of the intervention, to show what the imperialists did on the Russian territory. Now, these monuments were not erected in the towns or places where the Red Army committed genocide or crime of that sort. So everybody knew about Holmogory, for example. It was at the monastery that some 8,000 people were killed and buried, so the locals knew about it very well. In the 30s, there were some witnesses, eyewitnesses, and the medical institute at Archangels would send their students to practice on the bodies from the camp. These were remnants of unknown deceased, so medical students in the 30s would basically practice on the bodies of the victims of Red Terror. Now, what happened during the Soviet Union and what is happening with it now? I am trying to meet my schedule limitations. I'm about to wrap it up. This is the last part. This is an example of a monument at Motyuk Island. And up until the 90s, this was actively used, all the way until the end of the Soviet Union. There were some celebrations there. For example, in '67, that was the 50th anniversary of the revolution, and the the youth pioneers buried a capsule there that was to be opened in 50 years, which is this year. And in 2017, we were there with the Boy Scouts, with the pioneers, and we found it, but we didn't open it yet. So we'll first want to learn about who decided to bury this capsule there, and we'll open it and see what the message was. Now, this island can be reached by sea, by ship. It's a river island, or in winter when the river freezes. Nobody lives there, there are no regular roads, but there have always been trips organized there, all sorts of celebrations. Right now, the monument is derelict, as you can see. The wood is rotten. The door to the museum is wide open, and all the barracks, beds, you can actually see the writing on the wall by the prisoners, and it's all there, slowly turning to ruin. And this is because the victims of white terror are no longer interesting. It's hard to get there, there is no money in state treasury to support it, so the graves of the people who died there, or starved, or were shot, are no longer interesting to anyone. Now, about the victims of the Red Terror, this is the Holmogorsky camp, and this is a photograph from July this year. As it was explained to me, the Orthodox Church wants the rebirth of this monastery. They found a sponsor. Well, let me rephrase that. They are waiting for the sponsor to repaint and basically do it up again. So they want this place to be revitalized, and the first ideas were back in the mid-90s. First, they wanted to put up fencing around the monastery, and when they started digging holes for the fencing, they found 18 bags of bones. So even though there were no monuments there, this is a mass grave that nobody had paid any attention to before. When this was noticed in the 90s, they understood they needed to put up a monument, and they approached local authorities. They told them what had happened in that area, and that a monument is in order. There's a commemorative plaque to those events, but when one of the Tsars was imprisoned there, a cross was put up, but there are so there are monuments to other historic events like the imprisonment of one of the Tsars, but there is absolutely nothing to commemorate the victims of the Red Terror. And right now this is the symbolic grave, the 18 bags with the remnants of the bodies of those victims were buried there. So while the victims of white terror are being forgotten now, but the victims of red terror are now being commemorated. But there is no systematic plan on a local level to do that. Or at least I've not seen anything done on a more systematic basis. The only monument that's in good condition is the one at Archangel, which has been renovated last year. It was surrounded by bushes and trees and pretty much forgotten. teenagers would hang out there, and as per Russian tradition, they would just hang out drinking vodka, this kind of thing, like a public park. Right now, they've cleared the area and renovated it. And the reason is that in 2016, the daughter of Elizabeth II was there. She came in relation to the events of the war, and as a matter of local interest, this was shown to her as a monument of the British intervention. So this is basically the reason why this is in such a good state. And this has become part of the municipal landscape now. Basically, it is believed this is something that we can renovate, and we can also show it to foreigners to show what they did in revolutionary Russia. So from the revolution to today, I gave you a brief description of the different attitudes, but this shows that Russia doesn't really have an idea of what to do with these victims. There is no systematic work. There is there isn't an official position on the victims of red or white terror, and it's up to the local authorities to either put things in order, or, you know, when a high-level visit is coming up, then they try to renovate it. Thank you very much for listening.
Спасибо большое за этот интересный доклад. Мне кажется, что доклад профессора Новиковой показывает нам, насколько коммеморация революции на региональном уровне является живой темой, хотя на
It shows us to what extent recalling of the revolution is very important at the local and also at the central level. So it was very inspiring. The next guest, Professor Kari Alenius at the University of Oulu.
The author of 6 monographs dedicated to those issues, and the title of his presentation sounds very familiar to us: Finexit, Russian Revolution and the Finnish Independence. The floor is yours.
Dear colleagues, in March 1917, the provisional Russian government declared null and void all the oppressive measures that the Tsarist regime had directed against Finland during the period of Russification. Nevertheless, there were a number of unanswered questions. Since there had existed a personal union between Finland and Russia, had the bonds been wholly cut after the overthrow of the Tsar? If the provisional government was entitled to resume the full authority of the sovereign in Finland, did that mean that the same authority must automatically pass to any organ whatsoever that exercised the ruling power in Russia? At any rate, should a greater share than before of the supreme authority be delegated to Finnish organs or government? If so, how much so should go to the Senate or government in modern terms, or how much to the parliament? Soon after the collapse of the Tsarist regime, already in March in practice, it had become evident that the restoration of Finnish autonomy was no longer sufficient for a growing number of Finns. Even independence, which earlier had only been discussed in trusted company, was pondered rather openly. On the other hand, many Finns were still in doubt whether it would be better to accept the concessions the provisional government made and be satisfied with the return to full autonomy. How realistic was such an unprecedented aim, as such as complete independence would be at any rate? Finland gave de facto recognition to the provisional Russian government as the power that exercised supreme authority by carrying out its rulings. Thus, the Russian-dominated Senate resigned and the provisional government appointed a new Senate for Finland. The previous general parliamentary elections had taken place in July 1916, and the socialists had won an absolute majority albeit not of the votes, but of the parliamentary seats. As a result, the Social Democratic Party held 103 seats out of 200, the largest majority ever received by any party in Finnish parliamentary history. The Social Democratic Party was ideologically opposed to what they called ministerial socialism. They wanted the power centered in the parliament and not an independent executive organ such as Senate. However, a compromise solution was reached by the end of March. In the end, the parliamentary strength of the socialists encouraged them to change their established tactics, and they agreed to accept seats in the government of the capitalist country. There were an equal number of ministers, 6 socialist and 6 from non-socialist parties, but the deputy chairman, Oskari Tokoi, who is seen in the picture, belonged to the former. He was socialist. Tokoi's Senate was in fact the first government in the world to have a socialist prime minister. The leftist dominant position tempted them to transfer to the parliament as great a share of the Tsar's authority as possible. Here they also wanted to assure of the Russian Socialistic Party's consent. The All-Russian Congress of Workers and Soldiers deputies convened in June and called for full internal independence for Finland. However, the Congress also insisted that the final resolution of this question laid within the competence of the Constitutional Assembly that was to convene later. On July the 18th, the Finnish Social Democrats pushed through the so-called Power Act, by which the parliament declared itself to be vested with the supreme authority in Finland. This included the right to appoint the Senate and confirmed that Tokoi's government was the executive power for the time being. Non-socialist representatives criticized the Power Act on grounds of domestic politics, as it threatened to lead to the dictatorship of a single party. In a longer perspective, it would have created a state completely lacking of chief executive body. As such, the act was more an attempt to transform Finland into an ultra-parliamentary democracy than an attempt to declare Finland wholly independent. The Social Democrats believed that the Bolsheviks would succeed in their coup d'etat in July and take power in Russia. Contrary to this expectation, the provisional government remained in power from now on under Kerensky. Against the recommendation of the All-Russian Congress, the provisional government did not ratify the Power Act, but ordered the dissolution of the Finnish parliament on the last day of July. Simultaneously, it also called new elections. The Finnish political parties now had to decide whether to accept the orders of the provisional government or those of the Finnish parliament. In the Senate, there were 6 votes for and 6 votes against the publishing the manifesto of the Kerensky's government. Finnish non-socialists rejoiced Kerensky's call for new elections, as this opened an opportunity to put an end to the socialist majority in the Finnish parliament. The dead end was resolved by the vote of Governor-General Strachowicz, which was quite exceptional. Normally, the Governor-General did not attend Senate meetings, even he had the right to do so and take part in the decision-making. Accordingly, the Senate decided to obey the order. But the Social Democrats still found that the dissolution was illegal. As Russian troops barred the entrance to the Parliament meeting hall, the Social Democrats even tried to continue the parliamentary session in another building. The police barred their entry to this house as well. The Social Democratic senators also resigned from the government, while non-socialist senators kept on working as usual. The new elections were held in the beginning of October. The most significant result was that the socialists lost their absolute majority positions. The Socialist Democratic Party remained the largest single party with 92 seats, but the socialists were surprised, disappointed and bitter towards the non-socialists who had cooperated with the Kerensky's government. After the Social Democrats had lost their majority position in parliament, it became increasingly difficult for the parliamentary wing of the party to restrain the revolutionary wing. Because the Russian gendarmerie had been disbanded after the March Revolution, Finland lacked an official military organization and a sufficient police force in autumn 1917. Partly in order to fill the gap, two private armies were forming in the country. These were the socialistic Red Guards and the non-socialistic Civil Guards, or White Guards. And two sample pictures are being seen in this slide. The revolutionary elements among the Finnish socialists gained strength by the radical trends in Russia, as on 7th November the Bolsheviks seized power in Russia. The Bolshevik takeover transformed attitudes toward national independence. The cautious non-socialist parties that up to then had repudiated the ideal of national independence immediately wanted to separate from a Russia where radical socialists hold the highest power. The non-socialists were ready to explain that Russia was in chaos and therefore the exercise of supreme power there had ceased. The Social Democrats, for their share, were now willing to wait and negotiate with the new leadership in Russia. In the opinion of the non-socialist parties in Finland, the question of the supreme power in the country had to be finally resolved without any delay. On November the 15th, Parliament resolved to take over the supreme authority for the time being. A significant step towards a full national sovereignty was that no reservation was made on this occasion in respect to foreign policy and military affairs. In practice, this meant that Finland had declared herself de facto independent. On November the 26th, the Parliament appointed a new government that consisted of non-socialist representatives alone. Per-Evin Svinhufvud, later the third president of Finland, took the chair. The powers assumed by Parliament were concentrated in the hands of the government, and Svinhufvud promised firm measures to restore law and order in the country. The resolution of November the 15th was in fact a declaration of independence, but neither Finnish politicians nor foreign audience considered it such an act. In forming the cabinet, Svinhufvud, who is seen in the picture, insisted that all its members agreed that Finland be declared independent in due form. Parliament accepted the declaration on December the 6th, and its commemoration is annually celebrated as Finland's Independence Day. Illustrative of the already deep confrontation between the whites and the reds, it was not possible to arrive at the wording that would have been satisfactory to both camps. The non-socialist majority of the parliament rejected the leftist proposal that stressed the necessity of reaching an agreement with the Bolshevik government. This would have meant the creation of a Russo-Finnish joint committee that produced proposals for establishing relations between Finland and Soviet Russia. The winning non-socialist declaration of independence was accepted by a narrow vote of 100 to 88. At any rate, independence could become a reality only after the foreign powers had granted recognition to it and the Russian troops had withdrawn from the country. The withdrawal depended on Russia alone, and in regard to foreign recognition, Russia also held a key position. Svinhufvud's government tried first to gain recognition of Finland's independence from her democratic neighbors and the most important Western powers. Finnish government did not succeed in this, however, as no other country was ready to give a recognition before a favorable decision had come from Russia. Svinhufvud was unwilling to turn to the Soviet government because he feared that by entering into relations with the Bolsheviks might make it difficult to gain recognition from a non-socialist successor regime in Russia. An important push factor in the situation was that Germany was engaged in peace negotiations with the Soviet government, and Germany put hard pressure on Svinhufvud to ask Lenin to recognize Finnish independence. On the other hand, the Soviet government wanted to show to the world that it alone possessed full power in Russia. Moreover, the Bolsheviks had stated that all nations had the right for self-determination, although it was not a true aim. The Bolsheviks believed that after a socialist revolution in Finland that would take place soon, the Finns would be among the first to freely join Russia again. Due to this kind of calculation, the Soviet government was ready to recognize Finnish non-socialist Senate and Finnish national independence. And several other recognitions of most of other countries followed during the next days and weeks. However, Finland's independence continued. However, Finland's independence continued to be circumscribed by the presence in the country of Russian troops. In mid-January 1918, its strength was about 80,000 men, and the Senate was unable in its negotiations to extract a promise of complete demobilization. The Russian Commissar for Military Affairs, Badcock, on January the 23rd, ordered the 2nd Four Army Corps stationed in Finland to strip the civil guards of their weapons. Meanwhile, the Finnish Senate had declared that the civil guards were the country's army, so that lifting a hand against them meant in practice war against the Finnish state. As a countermeasure, General Mannerheim, who had been named commander-in-chief of the Finnish army, started a systematic attack against the Russians on 28 January. The majority of the Russian troops who had no desire to fight were disarmed after slight skirmishes. The Soviet government did not officially participate in the Finnish Civil War in 1918, as no declaration of war was issued by either country. Nevertheless, Russians and Russian aid played a significant part in the Red Revolt in Finland. The Red Guards were armed by the Russians and were in part led by Russian commissioned and non-commissioned officers, and a considerable number of Russian volunteers fought in some battles of the war. The decisive battles occurred in April, and the last Red units surrendered in the beginning of May in southern Finland. The civil war was over, but the war against Soviet Russia continued in the form of military expeditions from Finland to Russian Karelia, the most important of which were the Vienna expedition from March to October 1918 and the Aunus expedition from April to September 1919. These are two of the so-called kinship wars fought near Finland during the Russian Civil War. The Russian East Karelia was never part of the Grand Duchy of Finland, but it was at the time mostly inhabited by Karelians. Many advocates of a greater Finland considered these Karelians either Finns or at least a kindred Finnic nation and supported the annexation of Russian East Karelia to Finland. In the end, all expeditions failed, and Finnish volunteer groups were forced to retreat to Finland after heavy fighting against the Russian Red Army that was superior in numbers. During 1918-1919, several Karelian parishes had held the vote to join Finland, but Finland gave up all claims to East Karelia in the 1920 Treaty of Tartu. While the Soviets had not, as we noted, officially been at war at Finland, a state of war had in fact existed between the countries, which could be formally ended only by a peace treaty. The first proposal to conclude the treaty was initiated by the Soviet government in August 1918, but it was unsuccessful, as was the second round in 1919. A formal peace conference finally convened in Tartu, Estonia in June 1920, and its labors were completed with the signing of the peace treaty on October 14, 1920. The treaty stated that Soviet Russia had recognized Finland's independence with the borders of the former Grand Duchy. The treaty contained an important territorial change in Finland's favor, however. The Petsamo area, which is seen in a darker color in the map, was ceded to Finland. The cession was made as a compensation for two districts on the Karelian Isthmus, ceded by Finland to the Russian Empire in the late 19th century, at which time the Empire had agreed to turn over areas on the Arctic Ocean to Finland. Another point worth mentioning here was that the Soviets proclaimed that East Karelia would be organized as an autonomous area and shall enjoy the rights of national self-determination. The failure of the Soviets to keep the promise resulted in the final conflict between Finland and Russia related to Finexit. In 1921, when the Soviet system began to be enforced in East Karelia, the local people revolted and the rebels requested assistance from Finland. The Finnish government could not involve itself in the matter, but allowed the recruitment of volunteers and turned to the League of Nations and requested that an independent commission be sent to East Karelia to investigate. The Soviet government flatly refused all forms of cooperation, reiterating that it viewed the League of Nations as no more than a tool of Western imperialism. The uprising was crushed by March 1922, and more than 30,000 refugees evacuated to Finland. In fact, my time is up, so I won't read these conclusions or repeat anything, but I can show these some main points of view. I thank you for your attention and patience before the dinner, and I'd be happy to answer questions if I can. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Alenius. Since we have only 20 minutes, I will automatically open the floor for Q&A. And if you have any questions, raise your hand, introduce yourself, and ask a question.
Łukasz Adamski. Miałem вопрос profesor Nowikowej.
Łukasz Adamski, I have a question to Professor Novikova.
Очень интересного доклада и подумал о двух вопросах. Во-первых,
I have two questions.
польским интервентам в 20-х световых годов.
There were also the memoirs of the Polish interventionists, the monuments of the Polish interventionists after the Polish Bolshevik War during the Civil War, because according to the Soviet interpretation, the war was the Polish intervention. When you also show those deeply moving photographs about the terror, about this white and red terror, did you find any photographs or other documents concerning the fate of the Polish prisoners of war after 1921? Why I'm asking this question? Because the question of the Russian POWs in Poland is quite well documented, but there is no document about the fate of the Polish POWs from the same war.
Badcock. How can you differentiate maybe the attitude? You've told us about the attitude of the local committees to the problems of food, fuel, logistics, and so on and so forth. And how can you maybe differentiate the attitude of the local committees, Soviet committees, to the Bolsheviks during the summer maybe and spring-summer of 1917? Because the attitude in the capitals, it was one thing, and the attitude in different local places among different urban or maybe rural population, maybe there was some differentiation, I guess. И по-русски вопрос к уважаемому профессору Новиковой.
I have a question, or maybe a comment in Russian. The interventionists, especially the Britons, executed those who instigated rebellions. There was a legion doing this. There were rebellions, there were uprising, and that was one of the reasons why the Brits withdrew in September 1919. How can you comment on that withdrawal?
Professor Alenius, I have a question concerning the violence. I think it's impossible to explain. What is the general opinion? Why this level of violence in Finnish war? So unlike other countries, it can't be explained by experience of the First World War or a story of atrocities of ethnic or religious conflicts. So why is
it? I have a question to Liudmila Novikova, but I don't speak Russian, unfortunately, sorry. I have a question about victims of white and red terror. Firstly, what was the position of victims of white terror, for example, in Arkhangelsk or another districts? And what was the position of red terror? If there was mainly officers and soldiers and white politicians, or also civilians, and what was the proportion of civilians victims in white and red terror? Thank you.
Two brief questions. One to Dr. Badcock. Is there any idea that these local authorities, were they shielding deserters? Because we sometimes read of this huge number of people who left the army to sort of sharing out lands and so on. Did the local authorities do something about it, or did they bypass them? And on Finland, what's the part played by this Prussian Jäger battalion in the story of Finnish independence?
There are no more questions, so I think we have 10 minutes, so it's approximately 4 minutes for each of our speakers. Professor Badcock.
I have two questions to respond to. The first one from Professor Sergeyev, I think, and that is, what were the attitudes of local committees to Bolsheviks in the spring and summer of 1917? There's quite an easy answer to that if we go down to the lowest level of committees, so committees at village level or in very small urban areas, and that is that there was no such thing as Bolsheviks. If there was any socialist activity, it would quite often be under a broader socialist flag, or it would be exclusively socialist revolutionary, as the socialist revolutionaries did have more of a foothold in rural areas. And then if we move away from the very lower levels and into even into regional and district and regional level committees, you'll find that in spring and summer of 1917 that Bolsheviks were largely absent, and that where they were there, that they would be there in very small numbers. But that it would vary according to district. So I wrote an article about one particular district in Kazan, in Cheboksary, where there was one particular activist who was extremely dynamic and who was a left social democrat, but it would depend on the locale. In response to Lothar, I'm sorry, I didn't quite hear it. Did you ask about deserters? Yeah, so that's a great question, because that enables me to just really illustrate this question about locality. When we talk about responses to the First World War, by 1917, there is a common assumption that everybody wanted an end to the war. That is a misperception insofar as different local communities responded very differently. For some individuals, for some villages, for some families, there would be a perception that they had lost a lot to the war, that they'd seen their menfolk not come back at all, or be terribly wounded, or certainly be away from home. And so some communities really sought to see a continuity of this conflict that they were already engaged in. Others, on the other hand, and so those kinds of communities were the kinds of communities who rounded up deserters, beat them up, and returned them to barracks. But then in other areas, there were very well-known parts of districts which were considered to be havens for deserters, where communities were protecting and withholding their deserters. So I think that it really depended on locale. And I would also add, actually, that you would, particularly into the later part of 1917, you would probably find really quite a high degree of autonomy for some deserters who may well have started to wield a degree of power as often armed young men in these communities who may have actually, because you do see a subversion of traditional patriarchal, senior-based power relationships in rural areas as young armed men increasingly become important. So I would have thought by autumn 1917 you would start to see that kind of dynamic as well.
Работает. Спасибо большое за вопросы. К сожалению, я насчет поляков не знаю.
Thank you for this question about Polish prisoners of war. I don't really know too much about it. In the materials I saw from the 20s, I've not found anything. Maybe I was looking in the wrong place. I just didn't find anything. In the 30s, yes, there are materials about Polish prisoners of war, and there's scientific literature. About 1920-21, I have not found anything. About the executions in the Darlov battalion by the British, well, what else can be said? Yes, the participants of those rebellions were there. That was the main reason for executions in the north during the Civil War. The Bolshevik underground members were also shot, as were people who were trying to organize some sort of an uprising in the camps. So these were the main reasons of executions, and also for desertion, of course, or any unrest in the military, or trying to persuade others to desert. The White Guard executed people for that, and so did the British. The uprising in that regiment was actually the beginning of the end of the intervention, as you said. And the disappointment was that even if the Russians get good British officers, they still don't want to fight. That was one of the reasons, but that was not the only reason why the British intervention ended. Now, about the participation of civilians, or the share of civilians, the total number of those murdered. Now, the victims to the terror were mostly military, because prisoners were sent from different fronts: Kolchaks, Denikin soldiers, the Kronstadt, the Kronstadt sailors, and so on and so forth. So they would be people from different regions of Russia, and there were lots of people who fought against the Reds, against Bolsheviks, actively. Now, on the local level, there were lots of civilians from both sides. After all, war continued on a local level, one village against another, one partisan battalion against another. No one really cared if they were women or civilian. Not that many women, it was mostly men who were victims of terror. Women included mostly teachers, for example, who were sometimes shot because the Whites thought they sympathized with the Reds. And also members of the White administration would be shot, if not immediately, then very soon. But women were a minority. Also, officials, public servants were shot. Heads of the local land committee, people from the local commune. Sometimes the returning Bolsheviks would say, "What is this counter-revolutionary scum doing here? They must not be part of the new authorities," and then they would be shot. But in terms of percentage-wise, I don't think anyone can give you any exact numbers.
Case, because it was something that is not easily to be understood, and opinions and interpretations are split in Finland between all parties who take part in that discussion. But if I summarize a few things regarding the red side, the leadership, or the most active group within the Social Democratic Party, believed in the same ideology as Lenin and Bolsheviks in Russia, and they found it necessary to eliminate a certain portion of the population, the so-called class enemies. And they started the violence in January 1918, and as it easily happens in that kind of situation, first one side does something, and then there will be a circle of revenges and revenges. So the Reds wanted to eliminate a certain part of the population for ideological reasons, and for the white side I would say that according to the law that was in Finland at that time, the Reds were guilty of treason, and for treason you could have death penalty. And many people on the white side interpreted the situation just like that. All the Reds had been guilty of treason and they could be shot at once. These are the, I think, the two most important reasons why there was so great amount of violence and atrocities in Finland, although earlier in Finnish history we don't have that kind of examples, at least not too many, or perhaps they are from 17th century or the like. But the question was good, but there is no convincing simple answer to that. And the second question about the importance or role of the Prussian Jaeger battalion. Indeed, around 2,000 Finnish young men had been in Germany during 1914, 1917, and they had secretly had military training there. And as Finns did not serve in the Russian army, the people in Finland were unable in military things, but as these 2,000 young men from Germany who had modern military education, they were superior to everyone else. And as they took the lead in the White Army as officers and non-commissioned officers, then it was a key, they hold a key position. I think their role in the White Victory was decisive, and many other researchers share my opinion, I think.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank all our three speakers for your contribution to this panel, and we have finished the first day of our conference. Thank you very much. Thank you for all interesting questions. And tomorrow we start at 9 a.m. And we will continue to discuss regional and national perspectives on the Russian Revolution. Thank you very much.
Ja, proszę Państwa, chciałem jeszcze podziękować.
I would also like to thank our interpreters, who I believe deserve a round of applause. And the interpreters would like to thank you for listening. Now, I will ask the panelists and the moderators not to leave yet.